Well, it's 10 a.m. on July 23rd, and we'd like to welcome you to our Farm Office Live July edition. And it's been a few months, in fact, it's been since April since we've been together, and see a lot of familiar faces coming on board for today's program. Just as far as a reminder, today we'll be meeting with Farm Office Live, but reminder, we'll be back on August 7th for our next edition. Again, you can register for that program at go.osu.edu Farm Office Live. And again, back together as team, it feels like it's been months and months ago that we got together to talk about the hottest issues in farm management as well as in agricultural law. Today, giving some of the presentations from left to right will be Diane Shoemaker, our Extension Field Specialist in Dairy Production Economics. Barry Ward, Director of the OSU Income Tax School and Leader for Production Business Management. Peggy Hall for the Director of the OSU Ag and Resource Law Program. And yours truly, David Marison, Extension Educator over in East Central Ohio, Coshocton County. And behind the scenes, we have Julie Strouser, and we also like to thank Jeff Lewis for all his work in setting up today's webinar and the Zoom connections and everything for us for this program. Just a reminder, if you want to get the slides from today's program, as always, you can go to our website, the go.osu.edu/Farm Office Live. You can to get today's slides, as well as if there's something that you want to revisit. And here again, you can go back and the recording will be posted. We'll post that up hopefully by the end of the day so you have access to that. But even more importantly, the recordings from our previous programs and some of the issues that we talk about today, we talked in April or maybe in March or February, and those recordings, the past recordings are there. So you can go back through the entire, since we started these when we got into the pandemic, you can go back and listen to all those recordings at the Farm Office Live website. And again, you can put your questions in anytime, and there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to click onto that. If you have some questions, go ahead and drop those in. We'll be monitoring those. Some of those questions we will be answering live, and some of those questions we'll be able to put some of the responses right into that Q&A feature. So we ask you to use the Q&A feature, and we'll be looking at those. And again, you can always email those questions afterwards to me at marison.2@osu.edu, and I'd be happy to forward those to the team. And as always, your evaluations are really important to us, and we take time to look at those as we now get back into the monthly cycle of holding Farm Office Live programs. We use those comments that you tell us today to help craft the next program. So if there are issues that you would like for us to discuss more in depth, or maybe some issues that you are hearing that you would like us to talk about, don't hesitate to put those in the evaluation. Jeff has been kind enough to put that as you exit today's Zoom webinar. A screen should pop up for you to answer that evaluation. Should only take you a couple minutes to do that. And just know that those responses that you give are completely private. We just appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. So today's topics, we're going to start out. There's been a lot, you can imagine, a lot of legislative updates, whether it's at the state or the federal level. So we're going to break those two components up today. To lead us off, Peggy's going to talk about the state legislative update, and then I'm going to follow her talking about CFAP 2. That program is still open, as well as a couple pandemic assistance programs that have been released since we last met. And then Peggy will rejoin to talk about the federal legislative, some things that are happening at the federal level, which then ties nicely into Barry giving us a tax implications update from those things that are being discussed at the federal level. And then carbon credits, it seems like it's on the conversation. I don't think we have a meeting that we don't talk about carbon credits here across the state right now. It's one of the hottest topics. So Peggy's going to touch on that briefly. And then Diane and her team have been busy pulling together the farm business analysis numbers. Diane, I think really late at night from what I see from an email that I got from you last night, very late at night, they're working on these farm business analysis. But those reports are so important for us because they allow us as producers to benchmark ourselves against others and against financial standards. And then, of course, your questions anytime as we go. So with that, we'd like to welcome you all here to today's Farm Office Live. And Peggy, I'm going to turn it over to you, I do believe, with a state legislative update.
All right, thank you, David, and good morning, everyone. It's good to be back and glad to see all of you here to share with us what's going on right now in farm management and ag law in Ohio and beyond. I want to start with Ohio and provide a little bit of an update on what's been going on down at the legislature. They've been pretty busy. They're on a bit of a break now, but a lot of activity there toward the end before their break. So let's catch up on what has passed, and then I'll talk a little bit about some bills that are moving as well. Probably the most controversial bill that's received almost as much attention as the budget bill is the solar and wind facility siting bill that did pass and will become effective October 9th of this year. That's the bill that allows communities to have a stronger voice in the siting of large-scale solar and wind facilities. And it's been controversial because many who have land on which those facilities could be developed are a little bit frustrated by the community now having a voice in whether that development can occur in their area. So here's what the bill does. It first requires, and this is something that isn't in current law, those developers of a proposed facility to hold a public meeting in the community at least 90 days before they make that application to the Power Siting Board. Many times the communities found out when the project was far down the road. So this gives advance notice to the community that there is an intent to develop a large facility in that area. So they have to hold a public hearing and provide information about that project. At that point, the county commissioners can take action to prohibit or even limit that application. Also, counties will have the authority to designate, even beforehand, a restricted area or many restricted areas across the county where those types of large-scale wind and solar projects may not locate. So they can do that by their county commissioner authority through the public hearing process. And if they do that and there are residents in the county who disagree with the designation of those restricted areas, the bill also sets up a referendum process so that by initiating a petition, having it appropriately signed and submitted, that can go to a vote of the residents in the county, who can then decide whether they agree with those restricted area designations or can vote them down. So as you see, there's a lot of interplay here between the county government and the residents of the community in deciding where these large facilities can locate. There also will be more input in the approval process for an application where the chair of the county commissioners and the head of the board of trustees for the township where the projects would be located are now to be on that committee that reviews the application through the Power Siting Board process. And then finally, and this one I find incredibly valuable, are the decommissioning requirements in the bill. Previously and now, there are no decommissioning plan requirements, no performance bond requirements in our process, and those will now become a part of the law. Some of these developers have voluntarily submitted decommissioning plans, but under the new law, they will be required. And that will have to do with the termination of that project and how that facility will be taken down and removed from the property. So they'll have to submit a plan before approval, and they'll have to also then tie their performance bond to the costs that are laid out in that decommissioning plan. And they'll have to update that performance bond amount every 5 years. So I think those provisions are very protective of our landowners and should help those who do proceed with having a facility on their land. So that's Senate Bill 52. Along with that came House Bill 201, and a bit of, I think in my mind, one of those questions where you ask, why is the legislature spending their time on this? But they did, they passed it. This was pushed apparently by the natural gas industry in Ohio for fear that gas would be subject to this kind of process. that we're seeing the wind and solar facilities submitted to. So this bill guarantees all citizens a right to access to natural gas and prohibits political subdivisions from limiting or preventing that access within their boundaries. Although that has never occurred in Ohio that there have been any attempts to do so. But that bill is now in place. And then there's the state budget bill that was passed at the final hours as always, and is now effective. And you can see here some of the ag provisions in this bill, a lot of money toward H2 Ohio and phosphorus issues and the Western Lake Erie Basin. There's also some excitement on our part for the establishment of a Farm Production Policy and Financial Management Institute within OSU Extension. That was part of the budget bill, and some funding for that. And then we have a number of other somewhat minor provisions that were made in the bill. I did discover yesterday, actually, while going through the bill, that I missed something previously, and that was, let's see, I think it was a $10 million allocation for meat processing facilities. So that's not on this slide, but that was also in the budget bill. So we'll see some money going into enhancing our meat processing capabilities here in Ohio as well. Okay, so if we look at legislation that has not yet passed but is on the move, we finally saw some action on the Beginning Farmers Bill, House Bill 95. I've talked about that before. That's the one that would create certified beginning farmer designation and provide income tax credits for those who sell assets to beginning farmers and to beginning farmers who obtain financial management education. So that passed the House June 28th. Still no action yet in the Senate on that, but it certainly needs, it needs to gain some traction in the Senate, because it's done this before where it gets partway and then stalls and never goes anywhere. We also had the slow moving vehicle bill passed in late June on the House side. As you can see, the House has been doing a little bit more than the Senate here on some of these bills. But that one would address some of the visibility concerns with our horse-drawn vehicles, certainly in our Amish communities. So it would enhance marking and lighting requirements for those vehicles. There's another one that I had mentioned before, House Bill 187. This one intrigues me a little bit. It got attention and it moved and it passed the House in mid-June. And that would require all employers to provide their employees with statements of earnings and statements of the deductions that are being taken from their earnings. So that written statement would be required for each pay period. As far as a new proposal that is out there that has gained a lot of attention, I'm doubtful that it will move very quickly, if at all, but there is House Bill 349, and that would place a moratorium on animal feeding facilities, but only in particular areas and only under certain conditions. So it would prohibit approval of a permit of a regulated animal feeding facility. And you can see down at the bottom the sizes that are involved in meeting that categorization. And that prohibition on approving the permit or an expansion, either a new or expanding facility, is only if it's in the Maumee watershed and if ODA has determined has made some determinations about the phosphorus load in the Maumee River. So you can see there are some of the numbers that go with that. So it's limited. It's not a moratorium, as some have asked me, on all livestock facilities in Ohio. It's very limited, and only under those two situations, both have to be in place in order for ODA to have the authority to prohibit that if that bill would pass. Okay, and with that, I believe I am turning it back over to David.
Okay, you might have a time for couple clarifications on the large project defined under the first, your first discussion with the bill that was passed for local. How is large project defined? So there's your first question.
Yeah, excuse me. There is language in that bill that sets it according to the size of the energy produced. So we are looking at those large scale facilities that have to go through power siting board approval. This would not apply to any small scale on farm type facilities. So it's just those that are going through that oversight process with the Ohio Power Siting Board. And that's where we now have dozens of those across the state. Those are the facilities, the development projects that are being targeted for this community voice.
Super. And then the second question is a follow-up to some of the money that was allocated in the state budget, and that was from Bruce. Is it concerning the money for meat processing? Is that to support smaller operators to develop ODA-approved processing services?
It could be used for that as well. There will be there will be some program rules, I think, that will come out with that, Bruce. So we've yet to see exactly how they'll do that, but the allocation was there, and the language is about enhancing meat processing capabilities in Ohio. So I don't think it's targeted at only small facility, but I think that would be inclusive. We go small to large, the whole system, looking at the infrastructure that we have for that.
And that will tie in nicely to some of the things that probably are happening at the federal level, some money that's helping for meat processing as well. So you're going to have a double approach there. Definite weakness that was shown during coronavirus is the slowdown of the processing sector. So trying to address some of those things. So thank you, Peggy.
Hey, David, I've got one more question for Peggy, if I'm allowed to ask one.
Sure, Barry.
It's House Bill 187 on the earnings statements. Do we know any more details? Is that going to be, if it moves forward, is that going to be for all employers and employees?
Yes.
Or there are carve outs for farms or anything?
No, the
Okay.
language is all employers.
Okay.
With one or more employees.
Oh.
So it's everybody. But what's interesting about it, I should have mentioned, is there's not a serious penalty that comes with not providing that. What there is instead is a mechanism for employees to report that employer, and then some pressure put on that employer to comply with those provisions. There are no fines, fees, nothing like that tied with it, but it's more more of let's encourage this sharing of information with your employees, and we'll keep pushing you to do that. So an employer could be held in violation, but no serious ramifications from that violation. Just want them to comply.
Great question, Barry. Okay, so from moving on from the state legislature, we're going to go now focus our attention on some things that are on the federal side, so from the state now to the federal. And the first is, of course, we've talked, it seems like at every one of these, about some of the coronavirus food assistance programs, going back to the early days, even in the CARES. But last time when we met in April, we were talking about an extension for CFAP 2. And one of those things that they've extended it, so they reopened basically the sign up for at least 60 days, starting on April 5th. So you can see that we're well beyond 60 days from April 5th, but this program is still open. Some of the modifications that were made, there was a revisit back to CFAP 1 with the payment rates for cattle. There was some eligible flat rate and trigger crops that were updated $20 per acre. And of course, there was some movement within the additional assistance program with processing some of those eligible payments. So when they opened this back up, it allowed for more people to apply for the program. Just as far as a current, where we are at today for CFAP 2, there's been $13.76 billion paid to over 914,000 applicants. So from April to where we stand today, that's an increase of $49 billion, almost $500 million worth of money that was allocated to over 35,000 producers. When we look at Ohio, the Ohio previously was at 340.6 million. So now Ohio producers have received 347 million. So since April, an additional $6.4 million was paid to an additional 1,100 producers here in the state of Ohio. So sign up still continues, albeit very slow right now. We do not have an idea on when the program is going to close. However, I would anticipate that might be here in the next 6 to 8 weeks. So you'll need to be, if you are not enrolled in the CFAP 2 program as a producer, we encourage you to check that out. If you want to find out more information about the changes that were made in CFAP 2 back in April, of course, you can go back to our April 9th recording and listen to that at your leisure. A couple other things that have hit the wire, and some of these you may not be aware of because it just happened within the last couple of weeks. First, it was announced earlier this week about the Pandemic Assistance for Timber Harvesters and Haulers Program. So that's called PATH. So it was announced, and the Farm Service Agency is starting to take applications as of yesterday through October 14th. $200 million has been allocated for this program. So again, as we have moved through some of these federal programs, they've realized maybe some of the sectors of our agriculture and natural resource industry that might have not received the assistance that they might need. So for this is timber harvesters and haulers that experience a 10% loss of gross revenue from the year 2019 to the year 2020. So producers, folks that are in this business, so these will people that are probably have never heard of the Farm Service Agency and their programs, but they will now become acquainted with the Farm Service Agency, because you can be eligible up to $125,000. And the way they're going to calculate the PATH payment is taking your 2019 gross revenue, subtracting your 2020 gross revenue, and taking it by a factor of 80%. So in this program, of course, you have to be as a logger for a definition of logger in the North American Industry Classification System. There's a certain classification that you would be using on your tax return to indicate that you're a logger. Same holds true if you're a hauler, that you would have a certain code of the North America Industry Classification System, the code for to be a hauler of timber. So you are eligible for a payment. The way the program is going to work, when you make your application, producers are the harvesters or the haulers can, it's hard not to say producers when we talk about agriculture programs, right? But so in this program, these businesses will receive up to $2,000 immediately. And then the final amount will receive once the program sign up period concludes. So get up to $2,000 as soon as they apply. So if they apply today, could be receiving $2,000, up to $2,000 here shortly. And then as the program closes in October, on October 14th, then that final payment will be made. So if you do know of industry people in the timber industry in your communities, especially for those extension educators that are on maybe reaching out to our friends in the Forest Service and the people that we know in our communities, this would be a good touch point for them. Or if some of our tax professionals are on here today, you might have some of these as your clients. You might want to reach out to them and let them know about this program. The next one is a Pandemic Livestock Indemnity Program, or PLIP. I love all these acronyms that we get to learn in the last 2 years, but this was announced on July 13th. So again, this is only 10 days old. Applications were started to be received on July 20th, so this week, and that program sign up is going to be through September 17th. So this is for eligible swine, chicken, or turkey producers who suffered loss due to insufficient access to processing facilities. So the loss had to occur because they couldn't get their animals to the processing sectors for the processing facility, and they had to depopulate. And that depopulation happened between March 1st and December 26th of last year. So they have figured a payment rate per head. So that payment rate was an 80% loss, and then there was a cost factor put in there for depopulation and disposal. Now, on this program, however, there is a single, and I'll show you here in the next couple of slides, the single payment rates and what those rate figures are. And then just know if you get paid per head for those that you had to depopulate, it's going to be reduced by any money that you received for that animal. So we know in the CFAP 1 and CFAP 2 programs, there might have been some money per animal. Well, if you receive money for those animals in that program, that amount's going to be deducted. So there's going to be a little, the spreadsheet and the program the FSA uses on this will be important, because that will all tie back to the previous programs. And no, there's no payment limitation on PLIP. But just to show you, this is on the swine payment schedule. So it ranges anywhere from the bottom side of 55.31 for those nursery pigs, so those pigs less than 50 pounds, and goes all the way up to a payment of $258.57 for those boars and sows that are over 451 pounds. So again, extension educators, maybe reaching out to, if you know there are folks in your community that had to depopulate, then there is a payment here for our swine industry. Now, as we move into the poultry payment rates, again, They have them based on classification. So it could be 32 cents for those chicks, up to you go down to your turkeys, your toms, your fryers, and roasters at $15.57 a head. So this is going to be the PLIP payment per head. And these payments that you see on these screens are after the 80%. So if you are a producer or know of a producer who had to depopulate, then reach out to them to let them know that the PLIP poultry payment rate is open, or the payments out there. Now, a couple other pandemic programs that have occurred are kind of, one is on hold, but the pandemic cover crop program, that was a program, and the sign up for that ended on June 15th. And that was providing some premium support for up to $5 per acre for most insurance policies for farmers to receive to help them with the cover crops that they're planting. On the backside, I think, Peggy, maybe you're the one who, maybe between you and Barry, talked about the American Rescue Plan. Peggy, maybe this was you in April about the American Rescue Plan, the debt payments. And we had a discussion in April about socially disadvantaged farmers and how there was provisions in the American Rescue Plan Act to pay up to 120% of loan balances as of January 1st of this year for any FSA direct or guaranteed farm loans or farm storage facility loans to socially disadvantaged farmers. So Peggy talked about that in our April 9th update. But since then, what has happened, a federal injunction has halted the USDA from making any debt relief payments. And that's currently in our judicial side of the system. And Peggy, I don't know if you have any updates on where you are, if you've heard anything about it, but if you're interested in more about that, there is a link there on the bottom of the screen that you can go to just to kind of track. The FSA is doing a great job of keeping it up on their website about what is and isn't happening on a variety of these programs, including this one. So Peggy, I don't know if you had anything to offer on that as well.
Yeah, it's one of those we're going to be monitoring. It's very early on in the process. The complaint's been filed and basically alleging that it's a discriminatory act to relieve that debt. But what's interesting is the debt is being relieved based upon a history of discrimination within USDA. So it'll be pretty interesting to see how that plays out. So we'll follow that, David. Okay, I guess it's up to me now. I want to make a clarification on the meat processing grants that I mentioned, because I think my answer may have been a little misleading. Small plants could be part of that, but they would have to be in existence as of July 1st. So it wouldn't be for startup funds. So I wanted to make sure that I clarified that. It's only to help those that are in existence to expand and become more efficient, have more storage, those kinds of needs. So it won't be for new startups, unfortunately. And that, unlike many of our programs, won't be through ODA, it'll be through the Department of Development. Okay, so moving on to some federal legislation. I'm not going to cover the tax legislation. Barry's going to follow up here after me and cover some of those. So let's take a look at some other things. You know, Congress is never quite as efficient as our states at moving legislation through. But if you take a look just at the bills that have been introduced and assigned over to the ag committees, it's just an exorbitant amount of legislation. So that's one reason why we don't see as much. There's just a lot of proposals down there. And I think the number is still something like only 7% of those proposals actually make it into enacted legislation. So we do have a few things on the move, nothing too exciting that has passed lately, but there's a lot of interest in this one that has passed the Senate, surprisingly. There's a lot of senators who are behind this Growing Climate Solutions Act. The chair of the Ag Committee, Debbie Stabenow, very much involved in this. And so that did pass the Senate in June, and it is now over in the House of Representatives. I don't know how much interest there is over there, but hopefully this will move through because I think this is very needed right now. There is a lot of interest in carbon credits and carbon programs. And this bill would create more transparency, a little bit of oversight in how those carbon credit markets are going to operate, and creating some information for landowners from the USDA. So there would be some studies as well that would assess what is going on with this emerging carbon market and trying to understand the market mechanisms and what is needed in order to bring, as I said, more transparency to that market. This bill would create a third-party verifier certification program, and that would go to this issue of verifying when and how a credit is actually generated and how that credit exists. It's kind of a tangible or intangible personal property type credit that we're creating here. And so we need a little bit of thought to how that market plays out and how those rights are verified and transferred. And this would bring some clarity to those issues. There would also be some reporting from USDA to Congress to help understand what's going on with that market and identifying some of the barriers that would prohibit or keep farmers from participating in that carbon market. And some funding that would come along with that. As you can see, $4 million initially, and then another $1 million a year for the next 5 years. So it'd be nice to see that one move, because as you know, we already have activity occurring here in Ohio and a lot of unanswered questions about these carbon markets. And I'll talk more about that later. There's a lot going on with broadband and infrastructure right now, but a lot of it is just push and pull back and forth. Several bills with broadband funds and broadband expansion purposes. So this is the one that I think is getting good attention from the House. The chair of the House Ag Committee is behind this and just held a hearing last week on this one. It's called the Broadband Internet Connections for Rural America. And that's why the Ag Committee is so interested. It really targets those rural areas, those gap areas across the country, and provides all kinds of loans and grants to those areas for broadband and infrastructure. So that one is gaining some interest in the House. And then we have you may have heard some of this news yesterday with the infrastructure bill or bills that are all floating about, that there's also some broadband funding within the infrastructure bill, but that one is not yet moving. This is part of that Build Back Better plan. And the Senate yesterday kind of put the brakes on that and said, we're not going to move it forward until we see the actual language, not too unreasonable on their part. The language of that bill is not yet fully developed, but there has been bipartisan support through a committee of senators who have agreed, at least in theory, to allocating those funds for infrastructure. And on the Senate side, that's about $579 billion in spending. And so those details are what is still being developed on where that money would come from. But they're expected to bring that back Monday and start advancing. So hopefully the text will be in place Monday and they'll start advancing that bill, and we'll see what they're thinking there. The House, on the other hand, has already passed its Invest in America Act, and that has a bit more funding tied to it, $715 billion. So that would be for all kinds of infrastructure, including that broadband infrastructure would be in both of those. So we don't know where that one's going. Another one I want to alert you to is this PFAS Action Act. And you've heard of PFAS, perhaps, the forever chemicals, something that we would not think we need to be too concerned about in agriculture. But you'll note there at the bottom of my slide that my kudos to Jeff, my attorney who works for me, for finding these things out about dairies who've had to close because of high PFAS levels in Maine and New Mexico, and forcing them to have to filter water. So the forever chemicals getting to some of our dairy operations. Well, this bill that did pass the House just this week would require identification and regulation of some of these PFAS chemicals. Now, a lot of them are no longer manufactured, but they are forever. So they're still in the system. And so we're trying to identify those PFAS chemicals and bring some regulatory authority over those, and some testing and identifying health and safety risks through this PFAS Action Act that is gaining some interest. And then I want to talk a little bit, not really legislation. Some would argue that it's quasi legislation though. The executive order that President Biden signed earlier this month, and this has to do with competition in the American economy, and specifically targeting competition within the agricultural sector of the economy. And you can see there a quote from the president about concerns for consolidation in the agricultural industry, loss of those smaller farms, loss of transparency and market power. And that's where this executive order is going to try to address some of those issues. So within that executive order, you can see a lot of mandates for USDA to do some research and reporting, and to consider new regulations that would address some of those issues, such as promoting fair practices for meat producers under the Packers and Stockyards Act, to remove some of those retaliation fears and try to minimize those, to allow the use of a product of USA label, to give greater market access opportunities and intellectual property issues that have hindered some of our smaller operators, and just basically trying to remove some of those barriers for market access that many believe the smaller agricultural producers, including even brewers and winemakers and distilleries, are subject to. So that executive order is now in place, and we'll have to watch and see what the agencies do with that. And now, Barry, I'm going to turn it over to you to discuss some of the tax proposals that we're seeing.
Okay, sorry, you caught me off guard. I thought there was one more slide coming. Okay, well, before we get into, and as I try to figure out all of this screen sharing, forgive me. Let me get pushed over. There was a question on Ever With Us, the Paycheck Protection Program. And Chris Soller threw out the question, and we thought we were going to get through one of these without talking about the Paycheck Protection Program. We've talked about it literally in every webinar that we've had with Farm Office Live since we started, so I suppose it's fitting. But Chris asked if there were any updates or anything new to consider as far as the Paycheck Protection Program, and primarily forgiveness, I expect. And you know, everything that I've been following, there's really nothing new in terms of all of the protocols that need to be followed. I did see here recently there is a Small Business Administration is soon to be launching a portal that will hopefully make it a little bit more straightforward for folks to be able to do that. So that's something new, I guess. And some of the rest of you may have some other updates as well, but I haven't found anything new that really we need to pay attention to. So I think everything is proceeding as what we had talked about earlier this spring. So if there's other questions, you can throw them out there, but I'm not aware of anything that's changed. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about tax implications of some of these federal pieces of federal legislation that are being discussed. And we've talked about this amongst our group as far as how far do we get out there in terms of discussing proposals and legislation that isn't really completely fleshed out. But there are a number of tax implications that may impact farmer clients and landowners as well. So that's something that we at least want to address and discuss some of the potential issues that might come down. So start out by talking about the proposals that were originally put forward by the Biden administration. And some of these were proposals that had some beginnings in some other legislation that was pushed out by other senators and congressmen over the last several months. But the two that we start to talk about, and we have talked about in the past, is the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. So These pieces these proposals have morphed into what we've been talking about, I think, and what Peggy's already discussed in some detail, the bipartisan infrastructure plan and the Senate Democrat budget agreement. So, and this may change ongoing. It's ongoing, right? So many of you are following the news and are following some of the politics that are also part of this, but the bipartisan infrastructure plan is the one listed here at the top. And this includes some of the pieces that Peggy has talked about. We look here in the internet and the rural broadband, some of that is a part of this, but what mostly gets discussed in this is roads and bridges. And that's, I think, in a piece that there is some bipartisan interest, and thus the bipartisan group that has come together. And you've seen Rob Portman a lot leading this on the Republican side. So, someone close to home for us, one of our senators from Ohio. So this is continuing to get a lot of press. It's depending on what articles you read, it's about $1.2 trillion. The Senate Democrat budget agreement that then followed based on, first of all, this bipartisan infrastructure plan, including a lot of the president's priorities. Senate Democrats then took all the other pieces that were absent from the bipartisan infrastructure plan, and basically have lumped a lot of the pieces into this agreement. However, this agreement really doesn't spell out all of these things. It's more of a loose agreement and a funding total of approximately $3.5 trillion. So at least my guess is that it's going to include a lot of the other provisions that were in the American Families Plan. So what does that then mean? And you can see all the things that were listed there, a lot of social programs that are important to the administration. What does that mean then for pay-fors? So offsets, new revenue streams, if you will. So that's what we'll talk about here. And the bipartisan infrastructure plan, they have at least tentatively listed out some of the things that would be used as offsets or pay-fors. Some of this is new money. Well, most of this is new money. There's a couple of things that are sticking points at this point. And this first one here at the top is one that some of the conservative groups have really pushed back against. And now some of the senators, the Republican senators, are picking this up as an issue that they're pushing back on as one of the pay-fors. And this is reducing the IRS tax gap. In other words, providing more funding to the IRS. So this may be a sticking point going forward. We're not certain how much of an issue it's going to be. There's been other points that certain groups have pushed back against. Those especially that are following this, state and local investment in broadband infrastructure. Some have indicated that this particular pay-for or offset is essentially too good to be true. So there's some that have questioned whether or not this particular point is going to raise as much money as what this infrastructure plan is saying it will. So Peggy's already mentioned some of the issues that are coming forth also out of this, and the Senate did have there's a little bit of roadblock going on in the Senate, obviously, but there's also some other issues that are kind of behind the scenes. One of which is, if they are to pass this with Republican votes, would that then clear the way for reconciliation for the next plan in that Senate Democrat agreement? So some Republicans I know are pausing simply because they don't want to give the Democrats a clear path to reconciliation for the next plan. So that may be a hang up as well. So you can see there's a number of these things. A lot of this is repurposed money from past legislation, no new taxes. And the one thing that's noticeably absent, especially when compared to the American Jobs Plan, is this idea of an increase in corporate tax rates. And that was one of the key pieces that was a part of that American Jobs Plan as far as the offsets or the pay-fors, and that's the increase in corporate tax rates. Depending on what source you listen to, the most of the information was pointing towards a 21 to a 28% corporate tax rate change. So it would have been a pretty significant increase in the corporate tax rate. If you remember back to pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act percentages, however, it was 35%, and that was not a flat rate, which it is now at 21%, but 35%. And that was, we had a progressive or a tax rate table that we were looking at. However, anything at a high level of income was taxed 35%. So that's something that's absent from this. Now, whether or not that will get folded into the next piece of legislation, we're unclear. But right now, at least at the level that we're talking about in the first piece of legislation that's being seriously considered, this bipartisan infrastructure plan, that is not included. And yeah, I had to throw in a cartoon or a little bit of a funny here. Don't be like Andy Dwyer and totally bury your head in the sand about taxes. We know that perhaps sometimes we do feel like this. We're just too afraid to ask, but hopefully you'll ask us if you have some questions. Okay, the next thing, and this is one of the things that's continuing in the background, this Senate Democratic budget agreement, which, as I think about it, is more of a replacement for the American Families Plan. And how is that then going to be paid for? And this has gotten a lot of attention from farm organizations, mainly because of one piece, but there's a number of things in here that are going to be offsets if part of that legislation is passed at some point. And this is all of the pieces that I talked about earlier and Peggy mentioned, the 4 free years of education, along with renewing some tax credits for families and so on and so forth. So if this were to pass, this would be one of the bigger changes in the social contract in America since probably, it's been compared to some of the things that were passed in the New Deal way back in the 30s and 40s. So that's something that I'm not sure if we have the political will to do that at this point, but time will tell. So what are the offsets? What are the proposed offsets that we're looking at? Well, one of the things is that higher individual rate would revert back to the pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 39.6% from 37 of what it is now. Possibly lower the income thresholds subject to that higher rate. Long-term capital gains may be taxed differently, especially if you have over $1 million in gross income or adjusted gross income. Proposes that all income over $400,000, and here we see that number show up. This is something the Biden administration pointed out as they were campaigning and after they were elected, that no one under $400,000 would see an increase in taxes, but those above this income level would likely see some changes here and there in the way that they were taxed. The net investment income tax would come into play, this 3.8% tax, and there would be more income that would be subject to this tax if you had income over this level. So this may be a piece of this offset as well if this budget agreement were to be passed. Here's the big one that's bolded here at the top, and that is how capital gains would be treated, recognized, and then taxed at death. And it comes into play primarily because farms have a lot of assets that appreciate in value, namely land. So the proposal would treat the transfer of appreciated property at death as a sale, meaning that the unrealized capital gains in the hands of the decedent or that person that dies would be taxed at the time of death. So that estate, in other words, would have tax due. The heirs would have to pay tax on that appreciated asset value. So this is what's discussed and what you hear a lot of times, the change in the step up and basis rules. I think it's sometimes represented in the press as they talk about eliminating the step up in basis. In effect, the step up in basis would still occur. However, it would now be taxed instead of a tax-free exchange. Treat property transfers at death as sale. Each deceased person would be allowed to exclude up to $1 million in gain from taxation. So that's going to eliminate for many people any kind of a tax due on this capital gains that would be taxed. Married couple would each get their own exemption, presumably portable. So the second to die would have a $2 million exemption on this gain, this recognized gain now. And under current law, it's not going to be taxed. So we have what amounts to a free step up in basis on that property. I've got an example here that I'll just share, hopefully to clarify this for those that are not really clear on how this might affect them. You know, if we had property that we bought in 1988 for $1,000 per acre, so we're talking about farmland here, that's going to be our tax basis that we would then have to record and track. Now, if we were to, let's take, for example, if we were to sell that property now for $9,000 an acre, that's not included on the example, we would have to pay tax on that gain of $8,000 per acre. All right, so let's change the facts a little bit and change that to we now, instead of selling it, we're now dying, okay? All right, so we're dying at that point. The land is going to be valued, appraised at $9,000 an acre. Under current law, the heirs receive this property with a stepped up basis of $9,000 with no recognition of that gain, no tax due. Okay, this particular proposal, this new proposal, is now saying that if it were to pass, one of the offsets would be we're going to tax that gain. Okay, we're going to tax that difference, that capital gain, and $8,000 would be recognized and taxed on that estate. So it's going to be likely taxed at 20% capital gains rates. However, some of the language in these proposals is saying that at a certain level of income, we're now going to have to pay capital gain. Instead of capital gains tax rates, it's going to be ordinary income tax rates, which flips that from 20% to perhaps 39.6%. So this is an additional concern, I know, for some, especially those that have large estates, a lot of farmland that is appreciated in value since the time of purchase or since the time that it was gifted, which we would have had the carryover basis from that person that gifted us the property. So this is the big piece that most are concerned about, especially in farm communities, that is a part of this. Now, there are some exceptions, okay? Part of the proposal in the American Families Plan said that there would be exceptions or an exemption, if you will, for heirs that are farming, actively farming. They would not have to pay this gain and the tax on that gain. So there's protections, at least in the American Families Plan, that were indicated, protections for family-owned farms and other family-owned businesses. Assets passing to farming heirs would not be required to recognize that gain and pay the tax. So then there are some questions that are unanswered. You know, would this unrecognized gain, so that gain that we get a pass on, if we have farming heirs, would it continue to be tracked? Would it simply be deferred? Because if at some point 10 years down the road, those farming heirs that received that appreciated property didn't have to pay the tax, if they stop farming, would that tax, that gain in that tax then kick in? And then the other question, one of the other questions is, would it be a lien on the property? So we calculate the gain that the farming heirs don't have to consider, don't have to pay tax on, but would the IRS require us to put a lien on those assets? That's something that's come up as well. We don't know the answers. There's not a lot of clarity on that. Okay, so a lot of things to consider. In my opinion, that's the big thing. Right now, there has been no no language in either of these pieces of legislation as far as changing the unified credit. Okay, as far as the estate tax, that's something that's often discussed. There's really right now no language in either of these pieces of legislation or plans on changing the estate tax or the unified credit. At the end of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the unified credit sunsets back to $5 million adjusted for inflation. So that's something that we have to consider as well going forward. But right now, there's nothing in there specifically on the estate tax or the unified credit. Okay, so I'm at the end of my time and my topics. So I'll pause here if there are any questions and try to answer those. Okay, well, some may come up, and again, we're tracking this as closely as we can.
Barry,
There's a lot.
you did get one that popped in. Sorry to interrupt you. Will the farmland already set up in a trust be affected with the lack of stepped up basis?
As I've understood this and read and followed folks, trusts are not going to protect any of this. All right, so even if it's in a trust, farmland set up in a trust, it's still going to be impacted by this, the language. So yeah, I'm trying to think of what specifically you might be asking here, Tom. You know, if it's yeah, I'm not sure that there would be any instance where a trust would protect someone from this capital gains recognition or this gain recognition, especially the way that they've discussed, you know, the way that appreciated assets would have to be tracked, recognized, that gain recognized and then taxed for, especially if you have heirs that are non-farming heirs. One of the questions that came up recently is, you know, what kind of changes, what kind of effect might this have? Well, I think we would start to see folks that are non-farming heirs suddenly become farming heirs. I think we would see a lot of folks that would suddenly decide that, okay, we're now farmers. And I think that's going to be a fallout from this. What will it do to farmland values? There's a lot of discussion on how this might impact farmland values if it were to be a part of any legislation that was passed and signed. And I guess I would throw out my opinion. I'm really skeptical that we have the political will to pull this off. There are senators that are still moderate that I think are, well, perhaps not ready to make this big of a change in the social contract. But if it did happen, you know, what would it do to farmland values? It might have a little bit of a dampening effect, but I'm not convinced that it's going to have a big impact in farmland values. I think that we would see it, you know, the economics and interest rates would be the driving force, you know, and this piece of legislation would have perhaps some impact, but I think it would be very little. Okay, so I'm answering questions that weren't even posed. Okay, so I'll quit there and let the next person, and I think it perhaps is Diane. No, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear on that. So it's back to Peggy. Sorry. All right.
That bad penny that just keeps turning up. Here I am again.
You're the have all the good information. So thanks everyone for being with us.
Thank you, Barry. It's certainly a lot to get your head around all these tax provisions. So we appreciate that you're tracking all that for us. Be interesting to see what happens. So let's turn away from tax and talk just for a few minutes about carbon credits, because there is a lot of interest in Ohio on this topic and a big announcement this week of the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, offering farmers $40 an acre to sign up for their carbon credit agreements. And that's just farmers who are in the upper Scioto watershed, which is where I am in that area. So it's limited to that geographic part of the state, but and many know that Indigo Ag has been out recruiting farmers to sign up for their program. So a lot going on in this area. And I just want to highlight a little bit of information that we're gathering here at Ohio State, putting together, and think about some of the legal issues that come with these carbon credit agreements. If you're not familiar with the concept, it's been around for a long time. Actually, about 15 years ago, there was a lot of hoopla about, oh, the carbon market and carbon credits, and then that fizzled out. But here we are again, back with this concept of the carbon credit. And so those agreements establish a market basically for carbon capture or carbon reduction. And those practices that farmers engage in that either reduce greenhouse gas emissions or sequester, physically sequester carbon, those can be converted into a credit that can be sold on the open market. And there's a lot of interest now in that market because companies are wanting to have this kind of net zero emissions policy footprint. They're using that for marketing purposes. That's very valuable to many companies. Some have to reduce. So they either have to comply or they're willingly wanting to become, known as net zero emissions. And so that is really moving the market along right now, the desires to engage in that kind of a net zero emissions marketing practice. So we have these carbon credits. And as I said, actually in the legal world right now, we're arguing a little bit about what are they? Are they real property? Are they tangible? Are they intangible? Are they personal property? What are these things? And how do we track them in the legal world? But if there is interest on behalf of a landowner to engage in this carbon market, a couple of legal issues that I want to point out right now, and I'm working on a more extensive paper. I'll have some blog posts that will go into a little bit more in depth about some of these legal considerations to make in stepping into this new opportunity. So be aware that many of these markets they have their own rules. And so they have their own eligibility requirements that need to be met right off the bat. So you've got to be careful about selecting a market that for which you are eligible for. As I said, the Soil Outcomes Growth Fund, that is not available to everyone in Ohio. So make sure that you can meet those eligibility requirements. They're going to be about location geographically, about the type of crop or types of crops that you're growing. Many have minimum acreage requirements. So you can't just, put one small field into this. You've got to meet the minimum acreage requirement. And then a really important factor to consider is what practices are they willing to accept as practices that will create that carbon credit. So that's definitely a concern. Now, with nearly all of these that we've taken a look at, all of these markets and these agreements, and it's really hard to get your hands on the actual agreements. So we're going a lot from what they are saying about their markets, but there's this concept of additionality that landowners need to be aware of. And so if you have been engaging in a certain practice already and have been doing that for years, that practice most likely is not going to qualify as a carbon credit generating practice. We're looking for additional new practices, new or different practices, not pre-existing practices. And that's because those new practices are going to change that the greenhouse gas emission overall. So we need something that is going to affect the state of greenhouse gas emissions going forward, and not those practices from the past that may already be affecting that. Another thing to look for is the length of time. There's a wide variety. Some are just for a year, some are for 10 years. Some have automatic renewal provisions written in. And a concern I have from a legal perspective is, what exactly are we creating here and what effect could it have on any transfer of land? Is this a property type like a lease that could transfer with the land? Does it end? Is it a personal property issue that would end if the land transfers? Some of those issues are not clearly fleshed out. So we need to understand the length of time, how it renews, and what might happen to that if there is a transfer of that land. And then a lot of attention is being given to the certification of credits. And this is what the climate or the Smart Growth Act that I mentioned earlier would do, is create a third party auditor type system that would verify indeed a credit has been generated here. The practices are in place. We believe these practices yield this amount of reduction or sequestration. And here is what you now have accomplished that you can trade. There's a lot of uncertainty about that entire market, how those credits are, the methodology behind establishing those credits and the practices that actually do reduce or sequester carbon. So that's something to be very aware of, and certainly to work through the terminology in your agreement carefully to see how they are going to ascertain the practices and the credit created. Another issue, of course, would be the payment. And we've heard things all over the board on the amounts of payments, how they're calculated. Some of them are there's a guaranteed amount, but some of them are tied to the market and there's a price floor and it can fluctuate. So we have to be really careful at examining those payment provisions and how the payment would be made. Some are made annual cash payments. Some are other types of payments. I've even heard, but not seen, that some are crypto payments. Some of them require purchases or services from that person or that company that's bringing those credits together and reselling them on the market. So some holdbacks that might occur there too for certain practices that may not have been accomplished or accomplished correctly. So a lot going on in the payment area as well. And then many concerns about data. From what I'm hearing, and again, I haven't seen all of the agreements, but from what I'm hearing, they all address data. They want rights to your data. They obligate you to share that data and give it over to that integrator of those credits. And so there's a lot of data privacy issues that we have to be aware of. I know that some of them, like Indigo Ag, has mentioned some of the data transparency participation that they're engaging in. So we need to keep a careful watch on that data, what's expected to be shared and what will happen with that in the future. And then finally, as an attorney, I'm always worried about, okay, what if it all goes wrong? What kind of remedies are written into these agreements? What if we breach? What if they breach? Those, I really don't have a good handle on what kind of language is in the agreements for that. But it is something that we need to watch out for. So be mindful of that as well. Okay, so that's enough for now. We'll keep talking about this topic in future Farm Office Live webinars, and I'll keep an eye on it and try to gather more information as we move forward. Any questions, David, that I need to answer on that, or can I turn it over to Diane now?
Good to turn it over.
All right. Diane?
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be able to share some of our first 2020 Ohio Farm Business Summary data. And today we'll be talking about the dairy portion of that. And for those farms that participate, you can see in the shaded counties there that our farms are located primarily in that Northeast Ohio area, which is kind of Ohio's milk shed, and also the location of a lot of processors. The farms that participate do a whole farm analysis, and then these have done an enterprise analysis of their dairy and usually their crop enterprises too. So today we're going to hit on about 4 of the financial benchmarks and look at that dairy summary. I always like to set a little context for the numbers we'll be looking at. And a topic near and dear to dairy farmers' hearts is milk price, because that has the single biggest impact on whether they make money or not. So there's enough milk price information here to make anyone who's not interested in it want to poke their eyes out with a hot stick. But to take a quick look, the class 3 price is what dairy farmers have traditionally monitored to get a feel for what that price is going to end up being on the farm. In 2020 just threw that into total disarray. And the main culprit there was this producer price differential, which you can see in 19 averaged 26 cents for the year. And it's a plus or minus on that class 3 price. Well, in 2020 was a year of unintended consequences relating back to some legislation that changed how the class 1 price was set off of the class 3 and 4 prices. And so we had a huge negative producer price differential, which has initiated a lot of discussions and hopefully long-term will initiate some change in the milk pricing system. But I also wanted to show here what's happening so far this year. And our class 3 price is actually from January through June is averaging what we did in 2019, but we have an average negative producer price differential to date. So that really made a difference in that base price on the farm. As we look at 2019 at 17.21, dropped to 15.85 in 2020. And we've kind of hit the middle of the road at 16.19 so far this year. So farmers can impact that price by selling more components. And this all milk price kind of reflects what happened at the farm gate. So building on that uniform price, farmers have been able to add some value by selling more pounds of fat and more pounds of protein, and perhaps getting some quality bonuses, which are not as extensive as they used to be. But what's interesting here is when we look across the 3 years, we're looking at an essentially unchanged all Ohio milk price for these 3 years, which creates a number of challenges. So at 19, we were looking at things getting better, and basically we're at a flat rate there. And then we're looking at 2021 with significantly higher feed prices. So how did our farms look in 2020? Last year, we showed you data from 17 conventional herds. We have 17 here that I will share with you today as well. So number of cows, average of all farms, averaged 427. That's up about 20 head from last year. And that's typical of what we're seeing in the dairy industry is we're increasing cow numbers in Ohio, but on fewer farms. But we had quite a range that's also very reflective of Ohio, with herds from 72 cows to over 1,200 cows. And then we're going to share or look at how the high 20% of this group performed. And that 20% is selected on the net return per cow. So the numbers you see in this high 20% column will be for the same 4 herds who achieved the highest net return per cow. An important number on the farm is how much milk did we sell per cow? What did we actually get paid for? And our farms averaged $24,839, actually down just slightly from 2019. Again, a wide range with herds selling from less than 13,000 pounds per cow to over 33,000 pounds, which is really a phenomenal amount of milk. And that high 20% sold 6,300 weight more per cow on average than all farms. Next, we'll take a quick look at costs. Feed cost per hundredweight is that highest single cost on any dairy farm. And so our farms averaged 1073. That's down, up a little bit from 1047 the year before. A large range between farms as well, ranging from just under $8 to almost double that, or more than double that. Our high 20% was able to push that down to $9.41 per hundredweight. And then when we look at total cost, we're looking at total direct plus overhead costs. And those averaged almost $20 for all farms. Again, a large range from $13.66 to almost $30. That high 20% was able to push that down significantly from the average of all farms to $17.35. And then how much of that was covered by milk? We would hope all, but in the case of all farms, that total cost per hundredweight was not completely covered by the milk price. Now, total cost does include a depreciation charge, an economic depreciation charge for the use of the machinery, the equipment, the buildings and improvements. So that's not a cash cost, but that has to be covered over time. So that milk price per hundredweight, very close to that Ohio all milk price we saw earlier, $18.41, a large range from just under $16 to $23.84. And that average of the high 20%, $17.54 per hundredweight. So that high 20% was able to sell 6,300 weight more per cow and sell it for 87 cents less than the average. So they actually have a 19-cent margin here, where the average of all farms were looking at needing to have some good sales of cull cows, bull calves, et cetera, to make up that difference. So net return per cow, that bottom line, how did I do on a per cow basis? The average of all farms was a positive $792 per cow. That compares to $250 in 2019. A range typical of what we see, maybe a little tighter this year. There was a range from a loss of $300 per cow to almost $1,680 per cow net. And that high 20% all averaged over $1,000 per cow at $11.95. And that compares to just under $900 in 2019. But, those were some strong net returns per cow. But as we think back to last year, and we've talked about CFAP programs still being available, I think it's important to look at these in context of what impact did government payments have on this net return per cow. And so on average, government payments per cow were $684. Now, what it was included in those government payments, that can include indemnities for the dairy margin coverage program. We'll look at that a little more closely in a moment. And the most significant amount was from the coronavirus food assistance programs. And our high 20% averaged just a little higher at $726 per cow from government payments. The range is interesting in that some farms didn't participate in either program, and payments range from $0 to $930 per cow. So if we look at what the net return per cow was without government payments, it paints a very different story for the dairy industry and really highlights how critical those payments were to farms in 2020. And that net return without government payments, the average for all farms, we would have been at $108 compared to $250 in 2019. And our high 20% would have been $469 without government payments, almost just above half of what it was the year before. So these payments were really impactful to dairy farm businesses. Now, I indicated that part of those payments were the dairy margin coverage program, and that program is USDA's risk management program for dairy farms. It has replaced the minimum class 3 price or the support price that had been in place for decades. This program has evolved since the 2014 Farm Bill, and I think is as effective today as it has ever been. And what that does, if a farm chooses to participate, they buy up coverage up to a $9.50 margin. So if the all milk price, the difference between the all milk price and a calculated feed cost per hundredweight falls below the margin that you have purchased, which can range from $4, which is a catastrophic coverage, to $9.50, for which farmers pay a premium, then an indemnity is available for that month for the amount of enrolled production history. Now for Ohio, in 2020, there was 2.75 billion pounds of production history enrolled, or 526 farms enrolled in dairy margin coverage, which would have been little more than a quarter of all farms. And in 2020, if we looked at 950 coverage, we had just a few months, really critical months here in April and May, where the announced margin was less than $9.50. So if farms had signed up at that 950 level, they would have received payments in all 4 of those months. But farms who had signed up for 550 or higher would have received an indemnity for May, 650 or higher in April, and so forth. So in total for Ohio, USDA reports that about 7.8 million in indemnities were paid. So that was part of that government payments per cow. In 2021, it has become a more important program for more farmers in Ohio. There was a stronger enrollment with over 3.5 billion pounds of production history enrolled and 739 farms enrolled at some level. But as you look at what the margins have been here for the first 5 months of 2021, as we look back, if you think back to that early slide, our milk price is about the same as it has been in the previous 2 years, but this is a margin between that all milk price and a calculated feed cost per hundredweight based on corn prices, high quality hay prices, and soybean prices. So with the movement in the grain markets and hay markets, we've seen low margins for all of 2021 so far. And through May, USDA reports that more than $20 million indemnities have gone to Ohio dairy farmers who have purchased coverage in this program. So an opportunity that fortunately more farms took advantage of for 2021. Finally, let's take a look at some of the financial standards for these dairy farms, and picked out 4 here that we'll look at today. So our current ratio, our first 3 really look at cash and how much cash is available to the business, how strong is the ability to meet financial obligations as they come due. And so current ratio is one of those where we're comparing current liabilities to current assets. And our benchmark is between 2 and 3. We'd like to see industry-wide a current ratio greater than 2 is considered strong. In the dairy industry, our 15 measures of competitiveness, we like to encourage farms to get to 3 to 3.5. So meaning there are $3 to $3.50 of current assets to every current dollar of current liabilities. And that is a really spot on reflector of that ability of the farm to have cash available to meet obligations when they're due. So we had, for these farms, had a current ratio of $2.05 of current assets to every current dollar of current liabilities at the beginning of the year. And they were able to strengthen that through the year and ended the year with an average of $2.69 of current assets to every dollar of current liabilities. So that was a positive. And without those programs that were available to dairy farmers, those dollars that were added to that net farm income from those coronavirus programs, we would have seen a very different picture here. Working capital is simply the difference between current assets and current liabilities. And for these farms, the average increase was almost $244,000 from the beginning to the end of the year. And working capital alone, we don't have a dollar amount that's a benchmark. We want it to be positive, and that's not always the case. And we need it to be enough. And this next measure is the one that helps us determine or give us an idea of how much is enough. And that's where we look at working capital to gross income. So comparing the dollars of working capital that are available to the gross dollars, the total dollars generated by the business. And it reflects this increase we saw in working capital from the beginning to the end of the year. So that was 8.4% at the beginning of the year, about 17% at the end of the year. But when we look at what our benchmarks are, overall average, we are not where we want to be. We'd like to see more working capital reserves on these farms, becoming so critical as we continue to see tremendous fluctuations in milk price. That is our normal. And so we have to, on an individual farm basis, build those cash reserves to weather those. And the final item we'll look at today is debt to asset. And we're looking at this a market valuation, but how much of the business do we own versus how much somebody else owns? And so our benchmark here is about, we'd like to have someone else own less than 30% of our business. And we were able to see some improvement there as well. At the beginning of the year, these farms' balance sheets, they own 65% and somebody else owned 35%. And at the end of the year, a third of the business was owned by someone else, or 33% debt to asset ratio. So I think largely based on the assistance that was given, we are seeing some improvements in the overall balance sheet of these farms over time. We're in the process of finishing up the rest of the farm business analysis work for the year, and you'll be able to find the summaries at farmoffice.osu.edu or directly at farmprofitability.osu.edu. And for farms that would like to learn more about farm business analysis, we have a great team of technicians across the state. You can see their contact information there. And we also have some excellent consultants that work with the farm business analysis program over in Darke County. We have Don Garrett. In the Clinton County area, we have Tom Ackerman. And up here in Wayne County, we have Tom Wyatt, and they are great contributors to the program as well. I will throw it back to you, David, to wrap us up.
And as a former dairy guy, those numbers, wow. After government program payments, my takeaway was $100 per cow for those farms. So really the government programs really helped the last year, and it'll be interesting to see how we continue, because those numbers this year look about the same, don't they? We're tracking.
We certainly, as an industry, don't want to rely on that. And
right.
We want an industry to stand alone on it, by itself, profitably on its own, but that certainly was a great assistance last year. You can see the impact it had on those farms in particular.
Really good numbers, and I'm sure you guys will be pulling a full report together and distributing that later this year, right, Diane? So,
right, and we'll be focusing on crop numbers next. Great,
so stay tuned for that. Speaking of next, our next Farm Office Live will be August 27th here at 10 a.m. in the morning to 11:30. Of course, you can register at Farm Office Live to go.osu.edu/Farm Office Live. So we got 1 minute. Any closing parting shots as you were thinking, Peggy or Barry or Diane, as you were finishing up yours? Any closing thoughts or anything that came to mind you wanted to add before we say thank you for everyone being on, and we'll catch you next month.
I'll just have a short advertisement for our summer tax update on August 11th. So for those that are on our email list, those are tax professionals that are with us, you've already received information on this. We just welcome you to join us. We'll have a nice update with continuing professional. We'll have CEUs available, and anyone else obviously is welcome to join us.
Right, and stay tuned for more details. And as we close, we just want to say we have a friend, an old farm office friend, not old, but young, a young old friend. Ben Brown was on today from Missouri. So we're thankful that Ben was able to log on too, just to check out to see what we're doing. And with that, we hope you all have a great weekend. And until next time, August 27th.